Nobody called for help. That is the part that stays with you. Not the blood, not the floor, not the cold tile pressing against her cheek while the world kept moving around her like she was furniture, like she was a bag someone had left behind and forgotten to pick up. No, the part that lives in your chest long after you've read everything, long after you think you understand what happened, is this: people walked past her. Nurses walked past her. Orderlies with squeaky shoes and clipboards, and, somewhere important to be, they walked past her. For an hour. One full hour. 60 minutes. The length of a lunch break. The length of a bad movie. The length of time it takes to drive from one side of the city to another while the radio plays songs you half know, and you tap your fingers on the wheel and think about nothing in particular. She did not have the luxury of thinking about nothing in particular. She was lying on the floor of a hospital, a place that exists for one reason only, and she was bleeding, and she was alone, and the corridor hummed with the ordinary sounds of an ordinary shift, and not one person stopped. Ask yourself honestly. Just sit with it for a second. If you were walking down a hallway and you saw a woman on the floor, not asleep, not drunk, not resting, lying in a way that bodies only lie when something has gone very wrong, what would you do? What do you think you would do? Most people answer that question the same way. Confidently. Quickly. They're probably wrong. And the story of what happened to her is partly the story of why they are wrong. Her name was Mara Osei. She was 34 years old. She had gone to that hospital because she trusted it. Because that is what hospitals are for. Trust and pain and the reasonable expectation that if something happens to you between those walls, someone will notice. Something happened to her between those walls. Nobody noticed. Not for an hour. And by the time they did, by the time the hospital finally, formally, officially acknowledged that a human being was lying on their floor in a state of medical crisis, the decision had already been made. The calls had already gone out. The doors had already begun to close. The hospital went into lockdown. Not for a robbery. Not for a bomb threat. Not for any of the reasons you've seen in movies where the lights go red and the nurses run and the security guards draw their radios like weapons. They locked it down for her. One woman, on a floor, whom everyone had walked past for 60 minutes. This is the story of that hour, and the hour before it, and every hour of Mara Osei's life that built toward the moment she ended up on that corridor floor, invisible inside a building full of people whose entire job was to see her. It is also the story of what happens when a system is forced, finally, loudly, undeniably, to look at what it tried very hard not to see. Pay attention. This is the kind of story that feels like it happened somewhere else, to someone else, in a different kind of world than the one you live in. It didn't. It happened here. And it happened because of small things. Ordinary things. The kind of things that happen every day, in every hallway, in every institution that has learned, slowly and quietly, how to look through people instead of at them. Mara survived. But what she survived, that is what this story is really about. Mara Osei had a system for mornings, and the system was this: alarm at 5:45, feet on the floor before the second buzz, coffee started before her eyes were fully open, out the door by 7:10 regardless of what her body had to say about it. Her body, over the years, had said quite a lot. She had learned to treat it like a difficult coworker, someone you acknowledge, someone whose moods you account for, but someone whose complaints you do not allow to derail the whole operation. She had grown up in a household where you did not let the operation get derailed. Her mother, Adwoa, had raised 3 children in a 2-bedroom flat on the kind of budget that required arithmetic at the grocery store, actual mental arithmetic, standing in the aisle, putting things back. You did not call in sick unless you were visibly dying, and even then, you made the call fast, felt guilty about it, and started planning your return before you hung up. Weakness was not the word Adwoa used. She didn't need a word. She had a look. A particular pulling together of the face that communicated without cruelty and without softness that whatever you were going through was something you would get through, and that the getting through was more important than the going through. Mara had inherited that look. She'd pointed it at herself in bathroom mirrors for 34 years. The morning of a day, everything changed. She used it at 6:53, standing in front of the mirror above her bathroom sink, pressing one hand flat against the right side of her abdomen, where the pain had been living for the past 11 days. Not sharp pain. Not the kind of pain you go to the emergency room for. The dull, insistent kind that sits just below the threshold of alarm. Present enough to notice, ignorable enough to push through, what she had been doing, because she had a presentation Thursday and her line manager was already watching her hours and the GP appointment was booked for next week. And it was probably nothing. It was probably nothing. She'd said that to her friend Denise on the phone 3 days ago. Denise had said, "You sound like your mother." And Mara had laughed because it was true and because laughing at the true things is how you keep them from scaring you. Denise had said, "Get it checked." Mara, "I mean it not next week, soon." And Mara had said, I will in the tone that people use when they mean I probably won't. By Tuesday evening, the pain had changed character. This is the word she would use later, in the report, in the formal statement, in the conversation with the investigator who sat across from her with a notepad and a face trained to stay neutral. She said the pain changed character. Like it had decided to stop being patient. Like it had been waiting all those days for her to deal with it. And now it was done waiting, and now it was going to make itself impossible to argue with. She called the NHS helpline at 9:43. She was on hold for 22 minutes. The advisor who answered had a calm, scripted voice, not unkind, just practiced, and walked her through the assessment questions. Location of pain, duration, scale of 1 to 10, any fever, any vomiting. Mara answered honestly, including the part where she said the pain was a 6, maybe a 7, which it wasn't anymore. It was closing on an 8, but she said 6 because she did not want to be dramatic. The advisor told her to go to A&E, not urgent care, not wait and see, A&E tonight. She took a cab because the tube at 10 p.m. was an endurance sport she did not feel capable of, and because the pain, which was now no longer a 6 or a 7 or anything in the comfortable middle of the scale, had made her left leg go slightly wrong. Not numb, not paralyzed, just wrong, just slightly uncooperative in a way that made her nervous in a place below the level of thought. The cab driver asked if she was all right. She said yes. She pressed her hand flat against her side and looked out the window and watched the city slide past in its nighttime colors, orange streetlights and lit shop fronts, and people on pavements laughing about things that had nothing to do with her. And she thought about nothing because thinking about the specific thing that was happening in her body was something she was not yet prepared to do. Whitmore General was a mid-sized NHS trust hospital. Not the biggest in the region, not the smallest, the kind of hospital that exists in every city, known to locals mostly as where you go and wait. Its A&E department processed roughly 240 patients on a busy night. Tuesday counted as busy. The waiting room, when Mara walked in at 10:51, had the particular atmosphere of a place where time has been stretched until it is something other than time. People in plastic chairs in various states of patience. A child asleep across 2 seats with a coat over him. A man in his 60s pressing a cloth to his forearm. A woman at the back, scrolling her phone with the focused blankness of someone who has accepted that this is their evening now. Mara went to the desk. She gave her name, her date of birth, her address, her GP. She described her symptoms to the triage nurse, a woman in her 40s with reading glasses pushed up into her hair, in the organized, clear way that she described everything, because she was good at organizing things even when the things she was organizing were about herself falling apart. The triage nurse typed, asked about allergies, asked about the pain scale again. Mara said 7 because by now it was a 9, but saying 9 felt like surrender to something she wasn't ready to surrender to. She was assigned to the waiting area, Category 3, to be seen within 30 to 60 minutes. She sat down. She pressed her hand to her side. She looked at a poster on the wall about hand-washing technique. How to do it properly, all 7 steps. Most people skip steps 3 and 4, and she studied it with the kind of concentration that has nothing to do with the poster and everything to do with having something to look at that is not the inside of your own body. 40 minutes passed. A nurse came out and called 3 names. Mara's was not one of them. She did not complain. This was not in her nature. She had not been raised to complain in waiting rooms. She had been raised to understand that there are people worse off than you and that the people who tend to them are doing their best under impossible conditions and that your job is to wait and not make anyone's night harder. She waited. She did not make anyone's night harder. At 11:58, she stood up to use the bathroom. This is the moment. This is the moment that every subsequent event turns on, the way stories turn on small, unwitnessed things. A decision that doesn't feel like a decision, a movement that doesn't feel like the movement that will define the next hour of your life. She stood up. Her legs, both of them now, were wrong in that particular way. She took 6 steps toward the corridor. And then she was on the floor. She did not lose consciousness. This is important. She was not unconscious. She was entirely awake and entirely aware that she was on the floor of a hospital corridor at 11:59 on a Tuesday night, that she was looking at the base of a water cooler and a strip of linoleum that had lifted slightly at the edge, and that the pain, which she had been managing and containing and giving a polite and numerical score to, had done something she had no language for, something beyond the scale entirely, something that took the breath from her body and replaced it with a kind of white. She tried to get up. Her arms didn't cooperate. She tried again. Her body was issuing counter-instructions that overrode hers. She lay still. She told herself this was temporary. She told herself someone would come. She told herself that she was in a hospital, that hospitals are the one place in the world where lying on the floor while your body does something catastrophic is the least dangerous place to be, that someone was going to turn this corner in approximately 30 seconds and see her, and this would all, very soon, be managed by people who knew how to manage it. She lay still. She looked at the lifted linoleum. She waited. The corridor had a particular quiet to it. Not silent, never silent in a hospital, always the sound of distant machinery and muffled voices and the squeak of rubber soles on hard floors, but quiet enough that she could hear her own breathing. And she focused on that, on the sound of her own breathing, because it was the most reliable evidence she had that she was still here, still in her body, still something that could be helped. Footsteps. She heard footsteps coming from the left, from the direction of the nurse's station. She felt the specific relief of someone who has been holding their breath without knowing it. The loosening, the small interior exhale of, oh, okay, here we go, it's over, someone's coming. The footsteps passed her, a pair of white shoes in her peripheral vision, moving at the pace of someone going somewhere specific, someone who was not looking down, someone whose eyes were at the level of the corridor ahead, and not the floor, and she tried to make a sound, a word, a call for help, but the white that had replaced her breath had also replaced her voice, and by the time she found something approaching, the sound of footsteps were already gone, already turned a corner, already in a different part of the building entirely. She lay still. She waited. She looked at the linoleum. More footsteps came and went. She counted them later in a formal statement, the way you count things when you're trying to make something comprehensible. She counted 6 separate sets of footsteps in that first stretch of time. 6 people who moved through the corridor while she was on its floor. The hospital would later dispute some of these numbers. The investigation would, in time, confirm them. The corridor had CCTV. This also matters. There were cameras. There's footage. And the footage, which was reviewed by 3 separate investigators, which became central to the formal inquiry, which was described in official reports in language so careful and institutional it almost hides the thing it is describing. The footage shows exactly what Mara experienced from the floor. People walking past, a woman on a floor, and people walking past her, and the seconds becoming minutes, and the minutes piling up like something heavy. She began to feel cold. Not the ambient cold of an air-conditioned corridor, but the other kind, the inside kind, the kind that has nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the body deciding how it wants to spend its remaining resources. She recognized it in a distant, unattached way, the way you might recognize a fact you memorized years ago, but never expected to be relevant to your actual life. She was in shock. Some part of her, the organized, clear-headed part that had passed her performance reviews and kept her filing system in meticulous order, understood that this was the clinical term for what was happening to her. She was in shock on the floor of a hospital, and she was very cold, and nobody had stopped. She thought about Denise, not in a dramatic, life-flashing-before-your-eyes way. Nothing so cinematic. She just thought about Denise, about the phone call 3 days ago, about the way Denise had said, "Get it checked. Mara, I mean it," and about the tone she had used to say, "I will, I will." She thought about that tone, about the specific shape of the lie in it. Not malicious, not even conscious, just the reflexive noise of someone who has learned to manage everyone's concern before it becomes an inconvenience. She thought, Denise was right. This is what her mind served up, there on the floor, in the cold that had nothing to do with temperature. Not fear, not anger, not the grand existential reckoning that gets written about in memoirs. Just, Denise was right. And I said I will in that voice, and here I am. The corridor hummed. The distant machinery did its distant work. Somewhere in this building, in rooms with proper equipment and proper light, people were being treated. People were being seen. People had been assigned to categories and called by their names and brought through doors into the warm working order of medical care. All of that was happening in this building while she lay on the floor outside it. 37 minutes in, she managed to raise one arm. She got it to approximately shoulder height. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was not a wave. It was a raised arm. The most basic human signal for "I am here, I need something, please, please look down," held up for what she estimated was 40 seconds before her shoulder gave out, and the arm came back down. No one was looking. 49 minutes in, a porter came around the corner, pushing an empty trolley. He was young, mid-20s, she thought, though she was not confident in her ability to accurately assess anything at that point. And he had headphones in, one earbud in each ear, and he was moving at the particular pace of someone who has done this route so many times that the route has become automatic, the body taking over so the mind can go somewhere else. He registered her. She saw it, saw the slight adjustment in his stride, the fraction of a second where his eyes dropped, and found her, and then she saw the adjustment continue, past the register, into the thing that looks like someone deciding something very quickly, and then his stride normalized, and the trolley kept moving, and he was gone around the next corner. Later, in the investigation, this moment would become one of the most examined. The porter's account of it would be that he had assumed she was a patient who had chosen to rest on the floor, that this had seemed, given the general chaos of that Tuesday night, within the range of possible things. His union representative would use the phrase "ambiguous situation." The investigator's report would use a different phrase. The investigator's report would use the phrase "should have prompted immediate action." At 58 minutes, the charge nurse who would eventually find her, a woman named Patience Sequim, who had been working a double shift and had come down the corridor to check on a supply order, turned the corner, stopped, and did not take another step until she had made the assessment that something was catastrophically wrong. She was on her radio before she reached Mara. She had both hands on Mara's shoulders before the radio finished crackling with the first response. She said in a voice that Mara would describe later as the exact opposite of the corridor, warm and direct, and with no performance in it. She said, "I got you, you're okay, I've got you." And she meant all three things, and the meaning of all three things landed. Mara said later that she did not cry until that moment. Not from a fall, not from the hour, not from the cold, or the counting of footsteps, or the porter with the headphones. She held all of it together, the way she had been taught to hold things together, the way she had been holding things together her entire life. But when Patience Sequim said, "I've got you," something gave. It gave quietly, not in the way things give in films. Just a wet exhale, just a particular sound of a person who has been very alone and who has just, in one sudden moment, stopped being alone. By then, the machinery of response had already engaged. The bleep code, the crash team paged, and something else, something that began at the nurse's station when Patience made her first radio call, when the charge nurse on duty heard the call, and looked at the CCTV monitor and understood what she was seeing, and made the decision that would make this story something beyond one woman on a floor. The decision to lock down. Not because Mara was dangerous, not because the building was under threat, but because what the CCTV footage showed, a patient clearly in distress, clearly requiring help on the floor of a main corridor for the better part of an hour, was itself a kind of threat, and the people in charge of that building knew it, and the lockdown was, in the cold institutional language of what followed, described as a precautionary measure to manage the situation. The situation being Mara Osei, 34 years old, on the floor, for an hour, in a hospital, outside, cabs were redirected, ambulances rerouted. The doors of Whitmore General closed in the particular way that hospital doors close when the hospital itself has become the emergency, and the staff on that shift moved through the locked building with a particular feeling of people who understand that something has gone wrong that will not stop being wrong, just because it has now been acknowledged. Inside, in the corridor, Patience Sequim held Mara's hand and talked to her steadily, calmly, the way you talk to someone you are determined will stay, and the crash team arrived, and the assessment was performed, and the word that the registrar used, the clinical word that went into the notes and the report, and eventually into the news, was peritonitis. A ruptured appendix. Her body had been trying to tell her for 11 days, and for the last hour it had been screaming it at an empty corridor. She was taken into surgery within 14 minutes of Patience finding her. She survived. But in the room where the hospital's director of operations was already on the phone, in the meeting that was already being convened, in the documents that were already being pulled, in the union conversations and legal conversations and communications conversations that were already beginning to run in parallel, the survival of Mara Osei was not yet the story anyone was managing. The story they were managing was the hour, the footage, the 60 minutes of people walking past a woman on a floor. And that story, unlike Mara, was only just beginning. The surgery took 3 hours and 40 minutes. Mara did not know this. She was not present for it in any meaningful sense. She was under deeply and entirely, which is its own strange thing to consider. The way general anesthesia removes you from the most important hour of your body's life, makes you absent for the event that will define everything that comes after. She would be told the duration later, in the way she would be told most things over the following weeks, in fragments, by different people, in rooms with different levels of light, each fragment arriving before she had fully processed the last one. 3 hours and 40 minutes. Successful. Lucky in the clinical sense, which means the doctor used the word lucky while making a face that communicated it had been a near thing. When she woke up, the first thing she registered was the ceiling. Not her mother, who was there. Not Denise, who was there too, sitting in the chair by the window with red eyes and a paper cup of coffee she was holding with both hands like it was the only stable thing in the room. Not the tubes, not the monitors, not the fact that she was in a hospital bed instead of on a hospital floor. All of that came in the second wave, the slow sedimentation of consciousness as it reassembles itself after being chemically displaced. The ceiling came first. White tiles, a strip of fluorescent light. One tile in the upper right with a water stain in the shape of nothing in particular. She looked at that water stain for a long time. Her mind, still surfacing, still finding its edges, was not yet doing anything useful. It was just observing, cataloging, recording the ceiling of this room the way it had cataloged the lifted linoleum of the corridor floor, and something in her recognized that she was doing the same thing she had done out there, finding an object to look at when the actual situation was too large to look at directly. Her mother spoke first. Adwoa Ose did not say, "Oh, thank God," or "I was so frightened," or "Why didn't you call me sooner?" All of which would have been true. She said in a voice that had been sitting in a waiting room for 4 hours and had used that time to find its way to something past fear, past anger, past all the noisy things that were still going to need to be felt eventually. She said in Shui, "You are here." Not a question, a fact delivered with the weight of a decision. "You are here." Mara, who had not cried on the corridor floor, who had held it together through the cold and the footsteps and the hour, who had even held it together, just barely, when Patience at Queen said, "I've got you." Mara cried now, steadily and without sound, which is the only way she had ever known how to cry. The method her body had arrived at independent of her instruction, as if crying were something to be done efficiently and without inconveniencing anyone. Adwoa took her hand. Denise made a sound from the chair that was not a word. That was day 1. On day 3, a woman came to her room. She introduced herself as the patient liaison officer for the trust, which is a title that tells you something and nothing. It tells you there's a formal structure and that the formal structure has a representative and that the representative has been deployed, which itself tells you that the formal structure already knows what happened and has entered the phase of managing its relationship with it. The woman's name was Sandra Firth. She had blonde hair clipped back, a lanyard with a laminated ID, and the particular quality of someone who has said, "I'm so sorry this happened to you" enough times that the saying of it has become a separate thing from the meaning of it, a practiced gesture, a professional condolence separate from personal feeling. She was not a bad person. Mara, who was fair-minded even from a hospital bed with a scar and a tube still in her arm, acknowledged this internally. Sandra Firth was a person doing a difficult job in a structure that had made it difficult by design. Because the job of a patient liaison officer, when you strip the language down to what it actually means, is to be the human face of an institution at the moment when the institution has most clearly failed to be human. Sandra said she was there to explain the process. The trust had opened an internal review. Mara would be contacted by the review team. There are also, Sandra said with careful pacing, some things Mara should be aware of regarding CCTV footage. She didn't use the word evidence. She used a phrase documentation that forms part of the review. Mara, whose clear-headed organizing instinct had come back online somewhere around hour 36 of her recovery, noted this choice. Filed it away. She asked Sandra a question. She said, "How many people walked past me?" Sandra said she wasn't in a position to discuss specific details of the review at this stage. Mara said, "I know there are cameras. I noticed them when I went down. I know what the cameras would have recorded." Sandra said she understood Mara's frustration. Mara, who was not frustrated, who was something else entirely, something that had not yet fully identified itself, but that felt colder and more organized than frustration, said, "I'm not frustrated." I'm asking you a question. Sandra Firth left 20 minutes later with the careful smile of someone who has managed a difficult conversation without it becoming undoable. Mara stared at the ceiling. The water stain. Nothing in particular. She started writing things down that afternoon. Not because she planned to do anything with them yet. Not because she was already thinking about investigations or legal frameworks or the word accountability, which she had not yet said aloud, but because writing things down was what she did with things that were too large to hold in her head without becoming unwieldy. She wrote in a small-line notebook that Denise had brought on day 2, along with a phone charger and a change of clothes and the particular loyalty of a person who shows up before you ask them to. She wrote the timeline, the cab, the waiting room, the triage nurse, the 40 minutes of waiting, the corridor, the floor, the footsteps she had counted, the cold, patient's equeme's voice. I've got you. She wrote. How many walked past? Find out. She wrote. The porter saw me. She circled those 3 words. Not angrily. Methodically. The way you circle something that is going to matter later, even though you're not sure yet exactly how. Outside her room, the hospital was doing something institutions do when they have become the story instead of the setting. It was moving very fast in very many directions at once. The director of operations, Marcus Obi, had been in back-to-back conversations since Tuesday night, with the trust legal team, with the communications team, with the chief medical officer, with the trade unions representing the nursing staff, and the portering staff with the board. The board had been convened for an extraordinary session on Wednesday morning, which is the kind of thing that happens when a photograph gets out. And a photograph had gotten out. Not from inside the hospital. The CCTV footage was internal, protected, locked behind exactly the kind of access that formal review processes exist to regulate. But someone, and this was its own investigation, smaller and quieter, running in parallel, someone had taken a photograph of a secondary monitor of the nurse's station on Tuesday night. A photograph of the CCTV playback. Grainy. Timestamp visible. A woman on a floor in a corridor, and the corridor perfectly, devastatingly empty around her. It had been shared on a closed WhatsApp group by someone on that Tuesday shift. By Thursday morning, it had left the closed group. By Thursday afternoon, it was on Twitter. By Thursday evening, it had been retweeted 17,000 times, and the phrase Whitmore General was trending in the UK, and 3 national newspapers had called the Trust Communications Department, and the Communications Department had issued a statement, and the statement used the phrase deeply concerned and launched an immediate review 3 times in 4 sentences. Mara did not know about the photograph yet. She was not on her phone. She was in a hospital bed, which is not a place that lends itself to keeping up with things, and Denise, who knew, and her mother, who did not have Twitter, but whose neighbor called about it, had made a mutual decision that Mara did not need to know yet, that what Mara needed was to recover that the photograph and its 17,000 retweets and the 3 newspapers and the statement from the trust could wait until Mara was, at minimum, no longer on a tube delivering nutrition into her arm. The photograph could not, as it turned out, wait. On Friday morning, a journalist called the ward. Not Mara's mobile, the ward's direct line, which is a different kind of call, a call that requires a different kind of handling, and the ward sister who took it handled it correctly, which is to say she said nothing confirmatory and transferred the call to the communications team, and then walked to Mara's room and told her quietly that she might want to speak with the liaison office again. Mara asked, "Is there a photograph?" The ward's sister, who was a fair and decent person who did not want to lie, said, "There appears to be something circulating." Mara asked Denise to hand her the phone. Denise, who understood that the decision had been made, handed it over. Mara typed her own name into the search bar. The results took 2 seconds to load. That is a very short amount of time. It is not long enough to prepare for anything. The photograph was grainy. The way still frames from CCTV monitors are always grainy, blurry at the edges, slightly wrong in the way colors render under institutional lighting. But the corridor was clear. The floor was clear. And she was clear. A figure on the floor, one arm slightly extended, which she recognized as the moment she tried to signal, the 40 seconds she'd held her arm up before it came back down, and the corridor around her was so completely, so absolutely empty that the emptiness had its own weight. She looked at it for a long time, the way she had looked at the ceiling tile, the way she had looked at the linoleum, finding a stable point of focus while everything else did what it was going to do. Then she put the phone face down on the blanket and looked at the window instead. Denise said her name. Mara said, "I need you to find me a solicitor." Not I'm so upset. Not I can't believe this. Not any of the things that would have been true and permissible and entirely understandable from a woman who had been on that floor and who was now in that bed looking at a photograph of herself on that floor on a phone that could, at that moment, be showing the same image to any of the 17,000 people who had shared it. A solicitor. Practical. Organized. Aimed. Denise wrote it in her own notebook. The solicitor note. Underlined. Adwoa came in at 11 with food she'd brought from home. Jollof rice in a container with a snap lock lid because no one in her family had ever successfully recovered from anything on hospital food alone, and took one look at her daughter and did not say anything about the phone, which was still face down on the blanket, or the look on Mara's face, which was the look that Adwoa recognized from when Mara was 8 years old and had been told something unfair at school and had come home and sat very still and then done something about it. She put the container on the side table. She sat down. She said, also in Chui, "What are you going to do?" Not whether. What? Mara, who had not yet articulated it fully, who was still in the assembling phase, said, "Everything." Adwoa made a sound that was not quite a laugh. An acknowledgement. Something that said, "I know. I raised you. And also be careful. And also yes." Outside the window, the city did its city things. Cars and pigeons, and the particular gray of a British October that doesn't commit to anything, not rain, not sun, just a persistent ambient overcast. Somewhere in this building, Marcus Obi was in another meeting. Sandra Firth was composing another careful email. 3 journalists were waiting on return calls. The Trust communications team was drafting a second statement, one that would use the word apology for the first time, surrounded by so much careful language that the word apology, by the time it arrived in the sentence, had been padded into something that didn't hurt anyone. In Mara's room, Denise was Googling solicitors who specialize in NHS negligence. In Mara's room, Adwoa was watching her daughter eat jollof rice with the steady focus of someone cataloging a return. And Mara was thinking about the investigation, about the footage, about what the footage would show and what showing it would mean and who would need to see it and what the process was for making sure they did. She was thinking about the porter, about the word ambiguous, about the 16 other things the trust statement had carefully not said. She was also thinking about patients at Queen, who had not yet come back to see her, which Mara understood, the shift patterns, the double shift, the ward, but whose voice she still carried in a way that felt different from the other things she was carrying. Most of what she was carrying from that night was hard. That voice was not hard. That voice was the exception that made everything else colder by comparison. The hospital, as a building, continued to function around her. The machinery of it, the bleeps and the trolleys and the footsteps in the corridors at all hours of the day and night continued. At night, when the ward quieted into its night version of itself, a reduced and tired thing, she lay awake and listened to the sounds of it. Footsteps in the corridor. The particular squeak of rubber soles on hard floors. She counted them. Old habit. New context. By the time she was discharged on day 9, 2 things had happened in the world outside her window that she had not planned for. The photograph had been picked up by international outlets. The BBC had run a piece. And the Royal College of Nursing had issued a statement of its own, not defending the trust, not attacking it, but something more complicated, something that inserted into the public conversation a question that the trust had not yet been asked directly, a question about staffing levels that night, about the ratio of nurses to patients in that A&E department on that Tuesday, about what the corridor looked like when you understand that the people who worked in it were each responsible for far more patients than any guidance document recommended. This complicated things. Not for Mara. Mara had already complicated things by waking up and having Denise Google solicitors. But it complicated the narrative, the clean story of the photograph, the easy story of negligence and walking past, and nobody stopped. The RCN statement introduced friction, made the story harder to hold, made the villain harder to identify, which is always the most effective defense, because people with complex feelings are people whose anger has nowhere clean to land, and anger with nowhere to land tends to dissipate. Mara's solicitor, a woman named Jess Carmichael, who had been doing NHS litigation for 12 years, and who had the forensic calm of someone who has spent 12 years watching institutions try to make things complicated and has learned to find the simple thing underneath. Jess Carmichael called her on day 7 before discharge, and the first thing she said was, "I've seen the footage." Mara said, "All of it?" Jess said, "I've seen enough." And then she said something that Mara wrote down in the small line notebook verbatim because it felt important enough to have exactly. She said, "What happened to you was not a mystery. It is going to be made to look like a mystery. Our job is to make sure it doesn't stay one." Mara closed the notebook. She looked at the ceiling, the water stain, still in the shape of nothing in particular. She was discharged on a Thursday. Denise drove her. Her mother was in the back seat with the snap-lock container, refilled. The hospital's entrance, as they pulled away, reseated in the passenger side mirror, the automatic doors, the ambulance bay, the sign with the Trust logo in NHS blue. Ordinary. Institutional. The building where she had nearly died in a corridor while the building went about its business. She did not look at the sign for long. She had things to do. The first time Mara walked back into the building, she was not required to. That is the part that matters. Jess Carmichael had made clear, in her precise and unhurried way, that the formal process did not require Mara's physical presence at Whitmore General, that correspondence and documentation could be managed at a remove, that there was no procedural reason for her to walk through those automatic doors again for any purpose other than her own. The follow-up appointments were being transferred, at Mara's request, to a different trust. Her GP had been notified. The medical continuity was handled. She went back anyway, 15 days after discharge. Early morning, 7:40, before the A&E waiting room had reached its full weight of the day. She wore the same coat she'd worn in the cab on the night of, because she had not thought about it when she got dressed, and because some part of her, the part that dealt in logistics rather than symbolism, had simply reached for the nearest coat. She noticed it in the cab and considered what it meant, then decided it probably didn't mean anything, that the desire to make everything mean something was a habit of processing that she needed to keep an eye on. She sat in the waiting room for 11 minutes. She did not sign in. She did not speak to anyone at the desk. She sat in one of the plastic chairs, fourth from the left in the second row, not chosen for any reason she could identify, and she looked at the room. The poster about hand-washing technique was still there, all 7 steps. The child's chair from that Tuesday night was empty. The color of the room was the color all NHS waiting rooms are, a beige that has given up aspiring to anything warmer, a color that is trying very hard not to be any color at all. She sat with the specific feeling of a person who is trying to understand something that has already happened to them, which is different from understanding something while it happens. When it happens, there is no room for understanding. There is only sensation and response and the narrow business of survival. After is when understanding arrives, usually uninvited, usually incomplete, always slightly too late to be useful. She was trying to understand what it had felt like to believe, with genuine confidence, that being inside this building meant she was safe. It is a particular kind of belief, the hospital belief. It doesn't require articulation. You don't think it consciously as you walk through the doors. It is already there, built in a structural assumption about what the presence of the building means. The same way you assume a fire station has firefighters and a school has teachers, you assume a hospital has the capacity and the will to see you if you fall. It is a belief so basic that the absence of it has no template. You don't know what to feel when it's wrong because you never built a feeling for this particular wrongness. You only built its opposite. She sat with this for 11 minutes. Then she stood up and walked out. Standing in the car park, she called Jess Carmichael. Not because she had anything procedurally to report, just because Jess was the person she currently trusted most to talk to about the building behind her, and she had something she wanted to say out loud to someone who would receive it correctly. She said, "I think the building is not the problem." Jess, who was used to clients calling from places they didn't need to be, said, "Tell me what you mean." Mara said, "I spent 11 minutes in the waiting room thinking about what it felt like to trust that building. And I think the trust, the feeling of it, was never really about the building. It was about what I thought the people inside it were going to do. And the building just held the belief, gave it a shape, made it feel like a fact instead of an assumption." Jess said, "Yes." Mara said, "So the question isn't really what did the building do? The question is what did the people inside it decide to do, and why, and what made the deciding look like nothing?" Jess said, "Yes. That's the question." Mara said, "How we make them answer it." This is where the second stage began. The internal review had already produced a preliminary report, which Jess had received through formal disclosure channels, and which Mara had read in Jess's office on a gray Tuesday afternoon with a cup of tea she didn't drink going cold beside her. The report was a document that took 27 pages to say several things, while carefully not saying several others. It used the phrase communication breakdown 14 times. It used the word systemic 4 times, always in proximity to another word that softened it: systemic pressures, systemic challenges, systemic context. It did not use the phrase walk past. It used visual field limitations, which is the phrase institutions develop for things they cannot call what they are. The porter, identified in the report as staff member B, had given a statement. His account of having assessed the situation as ambiguous was included in the report without challenge or annotation. The report noted that staff member B had no prior conduct concerns. The report noted that the corridor's lighting conditions at the relevant time were within standard parameters, which means the lights were on and working, which means that argument, when it inevitably surfaced, was going to go nowhere. Mara read all 27 pages. She made notes in the margins in pencil, small, precise observations, the kind of reading a person does when they're building something, not just processing information. Jess watched her read and said nothing until Mara looked up. Mara said, "They're going to offer a settlement." Jess said, "Probably within the next 6 to 8 weeks. Based on how this report is structured, they're already anticipating litigation, and they've framed the findings to minimize exposure." Mara said, "What would a settlement mean?" Jess said, "Money. A formal apology. Probably a list of procedural changes they're committing to implement. Confidentiality, almost certainly. The amount would be significant given the severity of the incident and the CCTV evidence." Mara said, "And the porter?" Jess said, "The settlement would not preclude separate disciplinary action, which is internal to the trust." Mara said, "But you're saying that separately." Jess said, "I'm saying it separately." Mara put the report down. She looked at the window of Jess's office, which had a view of a car park, and, beyond it, a stretch of the city that looked exactly like the kind of city where things like this happen and are managed, and become something that changes forms enough times that the original thing gets harder to see. She said, "I don't want confidentiality." Jess, who had expected this, said, "I know." Mara said, "If I accept the settlement with a confidentiality clause, then the photograph of me on that floor stays in circulation, but the answer to it doesn't. People see the image. They don't see what was decided, and by whom, and why, and what was said about it afterward. The image becomes the whole story, and the whole story is not the image." Jess said, "No. The whole story is considerably more than the image." Mara said, "So we don't accept confidentiality." Jess said, "We can go that route. It will be longer. It will be harder. They'll fight the public element more than the liability." Mara said, "I know." She picked up the cold tea. She looked at it. She put it back down. She said, "I spent an hour on that floor because nobody was looking at me. I'm not going to spend the next year invisible inside a settlement document. That is not how this ends." The case became something bigger than a case before Mara had fully decided to make it bigger. This is how these things work. Not through a single dramatic decision, but through the accumulation of smaller ones, each one following from the last with a logic that seems, in retrospect, inevitable, but which at the time felt like a series of choices made under uncertainty by a woman sitting in solicitors' offices and hospital corridors and her own kitchen at 11 at night, eating things she didn't taste, reading case law she was not trained to read, learning quickly and without grace the language of a system she now needed to be fluent in. The RCN had not retracted its statement about staffing levels. This mattered, because the staffing argument, while it was being used by the trust as a complexity generator, was also, from Mara's perspective, a truth that needed to be named alongside the other truths rather than used to replace them. Both things were true. The corridor was understaffed, and the people in it made choices. The institutional failure and the individual failure were not alternatives to each other. They were the same event at 2 different levels of magnification. Jess helped her understand the legal architecture of this. The trust, as a body, had a duty of care. Individual staff members, within that structure, had their own professional obligations. The 2 things could be pursued in parallel. Usually in practice, institutions preferred it when the individual was blamed exclusively. Cleaner story, clear target, easier to contain, because institutional liability is more expensive and more structural and harder to discharge with a personnel decision. Mara was not interested in the easier version. She was also, somewhere in this period, contacted by 2 other people. One was a journalist. Not from the initial wave of coverage, but from a long-form investigative outlet, a woman named Priya Chandrasekharan who had been following NHS patient safety for 6 years and who approached Mara's situation not as a story about one woman, but as a case study in a pattern she had been documenting since before Mara ended up on that floor. Priya sent a single email, formal and precise, that said she was not asking for anything and that she understood if Mara wanted no contact with press, but that if Mara ever wanted to talk off the record about what she'd experienced, the door was open. Mara filed the email. She did not reply yet. She kept the door. The other contact was less expected. It came through the hospital's patient services department, officially, not informally. A request passed through proper channels. A nurse wanted to know if Mara would be willing to speak with her. The nurse was Patience Aquim. Mara said yes before she'd finished reading the message. They met in a coffee shop 3 streets from the hospital, chosen by Mara, neutral ground, the kind of place where no one looks at anyone else because everyone is too busy looking at their laptop. Patience arrived first. Mara recognized her immediately, not because she had seen her face clearly from the corridor floor, because she hadn't, not really, but because she recognized the quality of presence. Some people carry their work with them in a way that isn't visible and isn't consciously performed, that is simply the residue of doing a particular kind of thing for a long enough time. Patience carried it. She was younger than Mara had expected. Early 30s. She had her hands wrapped around a coffee, and she stood when Mara came in, not as a formal gesture, but as an instinct, the body moving before the social calculation finished processing. She said, "I'm glad you're okay. Not I'm sorry about what happened. Not I can't believe it. I'm glad you're okay." Targeted at the specific fact of Mara's survival, the thing that was not guaranteed, and now was. Mara sat down. She said, "Thank you for finding me." Patience said, "I've been thinking about that. About what it means that it was me who found you. I was the 12th person to come down that corridor since you went down. I know that because I've seen the footage. They showed all of us the footage, the ones who were on shift." Mara said, "What was that like?" Patience said, "I've been doing this job for 9 years. I have seen bad things. I have made mistakes. This was the first time I sat in a room and watched a recording of something happening to a patient that I could not explain to myself. Usually I can find the explanation, the pressure, the pace, the visibility problem, the distraction. Usually there's a reason that is not the right reason, but that is at least a reason I can hold. This I cannot explain." Mara said, "Were you angry?" Patience said, "I was watching 11 people make a decision. I don't think they knew they were making a decision. That's the part one couldn't explain. They weren't deciding not to help. They were deciding something had already been handled, or that it wasn't what it looked like, or that someone else was on it. Nobody was actively choosing to walk past a patient in crisis. They were each, individually, doing the thing a brain does when it needs something not to be true." She paused. She looked at her coffee. She said, "And I know all of that. I know all of it, and it still looked like walking past. Because what it looked like and what it was are both true. The explanation doesn't cancel the event." Mara sat with that. It was the most honest thing anyone connected to the hospital had said to her directly. Not the report's language. Not the liaison officer's practice condolences. Just the thing itself, named clearly, held up without flinching. She said, "Are you in trouble for meeting me?" Patience said, "I was advised against it." Mara said, "By who?" Patience said, "Trust Legal." Mara said, "And yet." Patience said, "I found you on that floor, and I've been carrying it. Talking to you is part of how I stopped carrying it alone. I decided that was worth whatever the advice was worth." They sat in the coffee shop for an hour and 40 minutes. Mara ordered a second coffee. Patience ordered a slice of something she didn't eat. Outside the window, the city moved through its ordinary afternoon, and inside the coffee shop, 2 women talked about the floor of a hospital corridor in a way that was not, at its center, about legal proceedings or photographic evidence or institutional language. It was about what it cost to be seen and what it cost to not be seen, and the specific weight of knowing the difference. When they left, standing on the pavement outside, Patience said, "I want you to know that what you're doing, not taking the settlement with the confidentiality, I think it's right. I think it's important. I think the report needs to be something that stays visible." Mara said, "You might have to say that somewhere more formal than a pavement." Patience said, "I know." She said it with the face of someone who has already decided, not someone being asked, someone who has worked through the cost of something and made their peace with the number. Mara walked back to the cab she'd booked with the particular feeling of a person whose understanding of a situation has just been altered in a way that won't alter back. She had come into the conversation with a legal strategy and a set of objectives and the organized architecture of someone who processes things by putting them in order. She left with all of that still intact. The strategy, the objectives, the order, but with something added that was harder to name. A witness who was not a witness in a legal sense. Something closer to an ally with her eyes open. A person who had said the explanation doesn't cancel the event and meant it from the inside of the institution, which was a different kind of saying it than saying it from outside. She got in the cab. She texted Jess, "Need to talk tomorrow." New development. She looked out the window. The city. The ordinary afternoon. The kind of day where nothing visible from a taxi window indicates that anything of consequence is happening anywhere. Somewhere behind her, in a coffee shop 3 streets from a hospital, Patience Queen was finishing her uneaten cake and thinking about the footage and the floor and the 11 people and the thing that looked like walking past and working through again and carefully the calculation she'd already made, the one that said some things are worth the cost of the advice you were given not to do them. And somewhere in a building with automatic doors and NHS blue signage and a corridor with working lights and a linoleum floor with a slightly lifted edge, the ordinary machinery of a hospital continued. The waiting room filled and emptied. Patients were seen and not seen. The hand-washing poster maintained its 7 steps. The story that Mara was going to tell. The true one. The full one. The one without the confidentiality clause and without the managed complexity of 27 pages of careful language, was not yet told. But it was being assembled, methodically, by a woman who had learned, in 11 days of ignored pain and 1 hour on a floor, the exact cost of waiting for someone else to notice. She was not going to wait anymore.